John Mouse in the News by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Simpkin, who lives in Apple Tree Cottage, was sitting in his favourite armchair watching television. After a hard day's work, Mr. Simpkin enjoys an evening's television. John Mouse, who also lives in Apple Tree Cottage, although Mr. Simpkin doesn't know it, wasn't at home. He was standing down the road at a bus stop. It was such a nice evening, he decided to sneak off on an adventure. John Mouse enjoys a good adventure. Eventually, a bus came along and stopped to let somebody get off. John Mouse nipped onto the bus without anybody seeing him. The nice thing about being the size of a John Mouse is that you don't have to pay when you go by bus. As long as you're not seen, that is. Ding ding went the bell, and the bus drove off to town. The bus arrived in town, and John Mouse nipped off the same way he'd nipped on, without anybody seeing him. There was lots of traffic and people around, and John Mouse had to be careful. The nasty thing about being the size of a John Mouse is that, if you're not careful, you can end up as a squashed mouse. So John Mouse was very careful. Now, the bus had stopped right outside a big, important-looking building. John Mouse looked up. Above the door, in big, important letters, it said, "Television Centre." "That looks like a likely place for an adventure," he thought to himself, and slipped past the doorman and in through the big doors. Inside was all hustle and bustle, and John Mouse found himself in a long corridor full of doors. Behind all the doors was where they made all the television programs. Eventually, right at the end of the corridor, John Mouse came to a door on which it said, "The News." "I'd like to see how they do the news," John Mouse thought to himself, and peeped round the corner of the door. There were cables and cameras and people everywhere, including the man who reads the news, who John Mouse had seen on Mr. Simpkins's television. "I could have some fun here," John Mouse thought as he looked around. As you know, or perhaps you don't, John Mouse is a mischievous mouse. Some mice are, some mice aren't. John Mouse is. Definitely. He grinned a mischievous, mousy grin. It was nearly time for the news. "Right, everybody, nearly time," announced an important man who was obviously in charge. "Everybody quiet!" he shouted, making more noise than everybody else. The cameraman got ready. The sound man got ready. The newsreader got ready. The important man got ready. Everybody got ready. And everybody included a small figure who crept up to the desk that the newsreader sat behind to read the news. The cameraman started the camera. The newsreader cleared his throat. It was time for the news. Mr. Simpkin was still sitting at home in his favourite armchair. "Oh, good," he thought. "Now it's time for the news. I wonder what happened in the world today." And he settled back in his chair to watch. "Good evening," said the newsreader in his best newsreading voice. "The time is 9 o'clock, and here is the—" He stopped with a puzzled expression on his face. "Here is the—" he said again, and stopped again. He tried once more right from the beginning. "Good evening," he said. "The time is 9 o'clock, and here is the—" He started to giggle, and then to laugh. He laughed, making himself red in the face. Mr. Simpkin at home couldn't believe his eyes. Now, you may have guessed what was happening. What was happening was that mischievous John Mouse was tickling the newsreader's leg with his paw, and with his whiskers. The newsreader tried again. "Here is the—" the 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 important man was furious. Up in his soundproof control box he reached for his telephone. Now, when the newsreader reads the news, there are just 4 things on the desk in front of him: the news, typed on pieces of paper; a glass of water in case he feels thirsty; a hairbrush to use before the news so that he can look neat and tidy; and a telephone. "Excuse me," said the newsreader to the camera, and picked up the telephone. Except it wasn't the telephone. John Mouse, who by this time had jumped onto the desk, had switched everything around. "Hello," said the newsreader, into the hairbrush. Mr. Simpkin, sitting at home, thought this was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. He laughed and laughed. The important man was furious. "Hello!" he bellowed into his telephone. "Hello? Anybody there?" said the poor newsreader into the hairbrush. The newsreader suddenly realized that you can't answer a hairbrush. "Oh dear," he groaned to himself. "I must have a drink of water." And he reached out to pick up the glass of water for a drink. But John Mouse had switched things around again. The newsreader was trying to drink the telephone. Imagine! Mr. Simpkin nearly fell off his chair laughing. The newsreader suddenly realized that you can't drink a telephone. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," he groaned, running his hands through his hair, and then realizing what he'd done, he reached out to pick up the hairbrush. But John Mouse had switched things round again. The newsreader was trying to brush his hair with a glass of water. Imagine! The water poured all over him, and this time Mr. Simpkin did fall off his chair laughing. And guess who laughed most of all? After that, John Mouse thought he'd had enough mischief for one evening, so he sneaked off and sneaked onto a bus and sneaked back to Apple Tree Cottage. Mr. Simpkin was still sitting on the floor in front of the television set, still laughing. John Mouse grinned, one of those mischievous, mousy grins that only he can grin, and went to bed. And that is the end of the news. Thank you for listening.